I was asked after the last class why we jumped from the genealogy and all that right to Mary and Gabriel, and whatever happened to John the Baptist and Zechariah. Well, I kind of decided when I started this outline to just concentrate on the life of Christ, and therefore John the Baptist, even though he's kind of part of the story later on, really wasn't part of this story. But okay, if I do it again, I'll put John in there. So we can talk about John for a few minutes. All right. John the Baptizer, which is a more accurate description of him. You remember that the announcement of his coming was in the Old Testament, just like Jesus. More recently, perhaps, than the Messiah. In other words, the reading we had last week in the Old Testament from Malachi talked about the coming of the forerunner. That would be somebody coming before Christ. Okay, so this idea of a forerunner is a late idea in the Old Testament. In other words, all you hear for most of the Old Testament is the coming of the Messiah. And sometimes the Messiah and the forerunner later on are confused in the prophecy. It's hard to sometimes, depending on the prophet you're reading, it's sometimes hard to decipher who is being talked about. There's a reason for that. Okay? Now, of course, we all know that God has his plan set in eternity. And therefore, obviously, the forerunner, the baptizer, was always part of the plan. But God, in his wisdom, decided not to reveal that part of the plan of salvation until way late. Not really until, in many ways, after the Babylonian captivity. There were some signs before that, but really the major prophecies about John the Baptizer don't really appear until after the Babylonian captivity. And as I say, there's a good reason for that. During the years of the kings, that is, during the years when Israel was an independent nation, it had fallen off the tracks, of course, very, very badly. And of course, the 10 tribes were destroyed 722 BC and carried off into captivity to a point where they did not return. They were absorbed into the places that they were sent. Therefore, we call them the lost 10 tribes. The southern kingdom of Judea, or Judah, didn't fare a whole lot better. We had some good kings. We had good King Hezekiah, good King Josiah. But in the main, most of their kings were evil. Most of the time, the religion was not practiced. Sabbath was not kept. As I mentioned to you many times, the year of Jubilee was never kept. That's every 7 years. Or the Sabbath year was not kept. And the year of Jubilee, which was the 50th year, so 49 and 50 would both be without doing any work and all. Those were never kept. Many other parts were not kept. The sacrifices were not kept up with. Idols were introduced into the temple area and throughout Jerusalem and throughout Judea. And so it became necessary in God's plan, he revealed that it became necessary in God's plan that he would have to send somebody ahead of the Messiah to begin the reformation of the people, to begin to preach repentance, to get them in the idea of repenting, to get them in the idea that God was angry with them, that they had fallen away, that they had lost their way, if you will. And so even though, as they say, this was part of God's plan from eternity, he didn't really need to reveal it until it became obvious that there's going to have to be a kind of a two-pronged attack or a two-pronged approach. I guess the best way that we could think of it is law and gospel. Not that John did not preach gospel, of course he did, but his main focus was on the law and to convince people of their sin, convince them they needed to repent. You notice in Jesus' early message, he too talked about repentance. But of course, then he talked a great deal about the gospel and salvation by faith and so on and so forth. So this is why, if you're wondering, why in the Old Testament you don't have prophecies of the baptizer back in Genesis, like you do of the Messiah, or back in Joshua or Judges or the Kings. You don't have those. You have prophecies of the Messiah. You don't have prophecies of John until way later, until the kings start turning bad, and then of course after the Babylonian captivity. That's when you really, and especially in Malachi, that's when you really have the baptizer being talked about in prophecy. So that's the reason. All right, next thing. And if you want, there's not a spot for it, but if you want to make notes on this kind of stuff, feel free to use the back of these pages. That's why I left them blank, so you could do that. But anyway, okay, so Zechariah is a priest. He's a Levite. His wife, Elizabeth, is also a Levite. In other words, both of them come from the same tribe. But of course, by this time, the tribes are quite large in population, and a lot of time has passed, and so they're not even, kissing cousins, right? They're far enough apart that their marriage is legal. As when we talked about the life and times of Christ, in other words, the atmosphere or the milieu that Christ appeared in, remember I told you that Levites sought out other Levites. Levite men sought out Levite women to marry. This was always a big deal with them, that if they could find people that were Levites, but far enough away in relationship, in blood relationship, that the marriage would be legal, would be okay, then they would seek out those kind of women. They wanted to keep the Levite line as pure as they could. There's no command to do this from God. This was just their idea. This was something they wanted to do. All right. Now, the other thing we know about them, of course, is they're quite old. And we are told specifically, as we were told in Sarah's case, the wife of Abraham, we're told specifically that she is beyond the age of childbearing. So she has experienced menopause, and she is no longer menstruating, so there's no chance whatsoever of her becoming pregnant. This is stated very directly in the Bible, so that you are very sure that this is something that if it happens, it's got to have to be a miracle. All right. We don't know how old they are. Okay? I don't know if they're, of course, in those days, if you lived to 50, that was a ripe old age. That was the life expectancy in the Roman Empire at the time of Christ, was about 45 to 50 for men and 50 to 60 for women. That was it. And it didn't really crawl out of the 60s or out of the 50s, I would say, until the late Middle Ages. So even at that, for the next 1,000 years, 500, 1,500 years, it stayed about the same. Matter of fact, in some cases, in some places, it went down quite a bit. So anyway, when they say he's old, we don't know what that means. The guess has often been stated that they figure these people were in their 70s or 80s. I doubt they were as old as Abraham and Sarah, being in their hundreds. I doubt that. That might have been mentioned if it's because it would have been quite extraordinary. But in any case, he's still working. He's still serving as a priest, so he's obviously in fairly good health. He can get up and around and do things he wants to do. All right, so they're old. He's serving in the priesthood, and they had certain sections. They had all the Levites scattered around Israel, divided into sections. Okay, and these sections were given names from ancient times, and they rotated. And so Zechariah's section, his group of priests, and I don't know, the historians are divided somewhat, whether or not these were priests all from a local area or priests that were related to each other some way. My guess is it probably was more likely to have a bunch of priests coming from a local area. Now, where was that area? All we know is that the hills of Judea. Now, where were the hills of Judea? Well, the hills of Judea are around Jerusalem in various directions. If you go south, there are some hills. North, there's hills. The only direction that you wouldn't find hills would be west, because Israel, of course, as you remember, Judea or Jerusalem is up in the hills. Let's see, let's do it this way. Jerusalem's up in the hills, okay, up here, up in these hills here, and so you're going downhill towards the sea. So to the west, the hills would be lower. To the north and south, they would be higher. And to the east, they would be higher and then lower when you get close to the Jordan River. So probably, I've always imagined Zechariah living around Shiloh, which was the first location of the tabernacle after the conquest, after the Palestine was conquered by Joshua. That's what I kind of see him at. So anyway, they lived in the hill country. He would be gone for 2 to 3 weeks. And this is not his service would be 2 to 3 weeks. This is not including the travel time. So when he knew his section was up for service in the Levitical rotation, he would leave. It would probably take 3 days, give or take, to go from Shiloh to Jerusalem. So when he knew that was going to happen, let's say it was going to be after a Sabbath, it was going to start on a Sunday and be for a couple weeks, he would leave maybe on a Wednesday, Tuesday, Wednesday, get down to Jerusalem. And when you were serving as priests in the temple, you were limited to the temple. You couldn't go anywhere else. That's the only place you could go. The concern there was if you went someplace else, you could make yourself unclean somehow by eating the wrong thing, by visiting the wrong place, going into a Gentile's house, for example, or who knows, something along those lines. And so you were told, the rule was, once you got to the temple, you lived at the temple. And there were plenty of rooms where they could do that. And you were by yourself, of course, so it was all men, kind of like a monastery, if you want to think of it in more modern terms. And then when your day came up, okay, to serve, you would serve. Now, there were certain jobs that you could serve as. One of the jobs that served as was the incense burner, okay? Other jobs were to accept the sacrifices, and other job was to, of course, slaughter the sacrifices, also to burn the sacrifices. So there were 4 or 5 different jobs that the priests had over the years to fill out. And you would have about an 8-hour shift, maybe 8 to 10-hour shift, and then you'd be off until the next day. All right. So the Bible tells us that Zechariah's section, Zechariah's group, was serving in the temple during this time, and that it was also you rotated the jobs. 1 week you might be the slaughter guy, the butcher, and the next week you might be the fellow who sprinkles blood on the people, and so on and so forth. We know the Bible tells us that his section was serving, and it was his turn to go into the holy place, not the Holy of Holies, because only the high priest went in there, and he was not a high priest. He was just a priest. But the holy room was the room before you get to the Holy of Holies. Remember, there's 2 rooms in the temple, and the temple was laid out in a kind of a rectangle shape, and so you had at the back. This is the Holy of Holies. Okay, that was in the old days. Of course, had the Ark of the Covenant, but the Ark of the Covenant had disappeared hundreds of years before the days of Zechariah. So there was nothing in here; it was empty. But still, the high priest would once a year go in there, and of course, this is where the big curtain was in the temple that you hear about on Good Friday. So there was the big temple. Now there was 2 tables in the holy place, just holy place. Okay, there were two tables. On one table here was the menorah. Okay, that's the candlestick. Okay, with 7 branches. Well, whatever. And over here, and this was the table of showbread. Okay, and it's usually spelled H-E-W, S-H-E-W, showbread. And just a old English way of saying show bread. Okay, showbread is bread that is brought is the first of the harvest. So this bread would be brought. Now, at that place was also during the rest of the year, depending on the sin that you were sacrificing for, you would bring a grain offering, and the grain offering was in 2 kinds. Grain offering could be an actual grain, and it was called a wave offering because you literally waved, or the priest waved the grain that you brought. You wouldn't go into the holy place, only the priest, but he would wave that at that table and set it on the table. The other kind of grain offering would be actual bread. You milled the grain, you baked bread, and you took that to the temple for a different type of sin. And that bread would then be called showbread. It was laid on the altar. Okay? So you had the table of showbread and the table with the menorah. Right? And the table with the menorah also served as a place where you would burn incense. So it was Zechariah's job that day, usually early in the day, probably 8 o'clock in the morning, depending on what time of year it was, to go into to have incense, and the incense was usually in a pot. Okay, it wasn't stick incense that we're used to seeing a lot today. It was incense in a pot. It was usually pretty expensive stuff, and he was charged with its care and with making sure that there was plenty in there and all that. And then he would take the prayers of the people. People would show up early in the morning, and he would take their prayers and requests. And he would go into the holy place, and then he would wave the incense and kind of, if you've ever seen this, maybe in a Catholic Mass, in a Roman Mass, how the incense vessel is swung or pulled so that you have this smoke that kind of goes up. Okay, you've seen that before, all right? So that's what's going on. So he does that. So he's burning incense. Now, when he was doing this, and oh, by the way, the Jews believed, and this was kind of an interesting point. The Jews believed that when you were going to do that, when you're going in and wave an offering, or go in and lay bread down, or go in and light the menorah, or go in and give incense, all right, that you should be chop, that you should be quick about it. Okay, we tend to think of great religious movements or great religious activity as somber, okay, which it is, but we tend to think of it as something that maybe was kind of slow. That was not always the case. That became the case much, much later in Christianity. During the Middle Ages, that became kind of a thing. Early in the Christian church and throughout most of the Jewish history, it was felt that if you hesitated, or if you took too long to do something, or if you didn't do it really well, if you stumbled or mumbled or stuttered or something like that, that God would be displeased. Okay? So usually when you go in to offer incense, you go in, you're walking briskly, you go in, you wave the incense, you say some prayers, and you're out in, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes, something like that. Well, he didn't come out for a long time. The Bible doesn't say how long, but it said longer than people thought. So maybe let's say twice as long. Maybe most guys are in there 15 minutes. He was in there for half an hour or more. Why? Well, because Angel Gabriel appeared to him. Gabriel announced himself, said who he was. Anybody remember what the name Gabriel means? What does the name Gabriel mean? What kind of angel was Gabriel? It's an archangel. Okay? How many archangels were there? Or are there? We don't know. Some biblical scholars believe there's only one. Some believe there are two. Some believe, mostly Romans, that there are 7. And some of the other names are given in the apocryphal books. As far as we know, there's only one real, actual archangel. You cannot make the case biblically that it's a class of angels. Some commentators will tell you, oh, it's one of the princes of the angels. I don't think you can make that case biblically. Okay, who's the other one that's sometimes referred to as an archangel? Michael. Okay, well, let me go back to Gabriel. Gabriel means man of God, which is odd because he's not a man. He's an angel. And but that's his name, man of God. Gabriel means man of God. Okay, all right. Who's the other one? Michael. All right. Well, Michael's name is a question, or it's a rhetorical question. Anyway, let's put it that way. Who is like God? Mikael. Who is like God? Well, who is like God? Only God. Only God is like God, right? And so most Protestant Bible scholars, myself included, believe that Mikael is none other than Jesus, the second member of the Trinity. Okay, this would fit well with when and where he appears in the Bible, right? So Mikael would be a theophany. A theophany is a visible appearance of God, or one of the members of the Trinity, which the only one that ever appears visible is Jesus, except for the Holy Spirit when he appears as a dove. That's also a theophany. But anyway, so Gabriel shows up. Gabriel announces himself, here, I'm Gabriel. Okay? And he says, all right, your prayers have been answered. Now, does that mean that Zechariah was praying for a child? I should have mentioned, of course, you already know this, they didn't have any children. Okay, so they're old, they don't have any children. Okay. Obviously, they've been praying for a child since they primarily got married. Okay, and who knows how many other years ago that was. All right. Didn't have any. Bible even goes to such length as to do something it did not do in the case of Sarah. In the case of Sarah, the Bible simply said she was beyond the age of bearing children. In the case of Elizabeth, the Bible adds something to that. Not only was she beyond the age of bearing children, but she was a barren woman. In other words, she was unable or prevented by God, frankly, since God is the one who allows conception, and God is the one who causes death or allows death, right? God says, I make alive and I kill. Only God. Devil is not allowed to do that. I mentioned it before, I mention it again, just so we understand always. If a life comes into this world, that is, if a life is conceived, right, from conception, that is because it has been allowed by God. In that sense, every conception is divine, right? And every person whose soul and body separates, that is allowed or caused only by God himself, right? No one else. Okay, so by the Bible saying Elizabeth was barren means God himself was involved in her life in that intimate detail and preventing her from conceiving children. Yeah, let's understand that. And understand that this was a curse. This was a curse, or seen as a curse by the Jews of that day. Every Jewish mother, every Jewish woman hoped to not only be married, but to have a son. And every Jewish woman, even if she wasn't in the tribe of Judah, hoped to be the mother of the Messiah. This was very commonly understood throughout the entire history of the Jews. This is why barrenness was such a curse. If you were barren, if you had tried and just never had any children, and therefore you were seen as barren, you were seen as the lowest of the low. You were seen that God had somehow cursed you. That's what they thought. And so Elizabeth was a pretty miserable person, right? She's not only now past the age of childbearing, but she's suffered her whole childbearing life being barren. Okay? All right. So the angel appears, says to Zechariah, your prayers have been answered, that they had prayed obviously before, and you're going to have a son. Zechariah's response is, yeah, says who? Angel says, well, I say so, and I stand before God on a regular basis. I see, me and God are on good speaking terms. We pass each other in the hall every day on the way to the break room, come on. And so Zechariah questions, right? And we'll talk a little bit in a minute. Yeah, we're doing good. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between Zechariah's comment or question and Mary's question. They sound almost identical, but they are not. Okay? We'll talk about that. So Zechariah says, I'm not so sure about this. I don't see how that's going to happen. And the angel says, well, okay. How about this? How about you'll be unable to speak until 8 days after the birth of the child, which is, of course, a day of, that's right, circumcision. Okay. When the child receives its name. Right. Okay. So, and of course, he's unable to speak, which then proves to him, okay, this angel means business. And obviously what the angel says is going to be true. And so he goes out. After the angel goes, he goes out. The people are worried by this time. What in the world's happened? Maybe he is too slow. Maybe he dropped the incense. Maybe he stuttered. Maybe God fried him right there on the spot, like they did Adonijah and the other guy, Sapphira. But no, Abihu. Thank you. Anyway, so he comes out and he has to dismiss the people silently. So I don't know, he gives them a blessing. Makes a sign of the cross. Sign of the David Star. I don't know. Anyway, he skedaddles them out, all right? And he's deaf, and he returns home. Now, of course, he returns home. He finishes out his service. The Bible says he finishes out his service, which, again, could have been a week, could have been another week. I don't know. But he finishes out his service, and he goes home back to the hill country. And lo and behold, soon afterwards, Elizabeth is pregnant. And then Elizabeth hides herself away. Why does she do that?
Well thought.
Why does she do that? It's a very interesting point. Mary doesn't do this. Other Jewish women didn't do this. This was not common. This was, matter of fact, this was kind of unheard of. If you were a Jewish wife and you were pregnant, you kind of walked around the village going, Yes.
Well, like he said, it's probably shame because she knew she was barren and she couldn't figure out how she got pregnant.
Oh, I think she knew.
Well, didn't she laugh?
Huh?
Didn't she laugh?
No, that was Sarah. That was Sarah.
Maybe that it was guilt because
I think the answer is much simpler, folks, than that.
she got pregnant while Mark was gone.
Well, yes, it's certainly possible that somebody might think that she was fooling around while Zechariah was down in Jerusalem. I think that's a stretch. I think a much simpler explanation is this woman's along in years, right? What do we do when a 40-year-old woman, like these Hollywood people a lot of times do nowadays, 41, 42, 45, you know, what do? They get pregnant. What happens? Do they still go shoot movies? No, they don't go out shoot movies, especially going to shoot the new Indiana Jones movie or something. No, they don't do that. They're going to jumping off of high buildings, you know, or doing police detective work or whatever. No, what do? They keep it easy. They keep it calm, right?
Yeah,
Right?
she doesn't want to lose it.
That's right. If you've got you know nieces or cousins or daughters or granddaughters, you know, who are up there, you know, past 35, past 40 maybe, or even you talk to an OBGYN and you ask OBGYN what happens when a woman 42, 43, 44 gets pregnant. The OBG will say what? Well, boy, she needs to take it easy. She needs to really watch it. Okay, I'm sure that this happened. I'm sure women late in life, because why? How can I say that? Because families were 12, 13, 14 kids. Okay? If you start having kids when you're 14, you're still going to be having kids when you're 44, you know, in a lot of cases. And I'm sure a lot of those wound up to be miscarriages or stillbirths. And so I'm sure that by this time in history, it is a well believed thing. If you're up there in years, okay, you should take it easy. You should stay indoors and, you know, take it easy, sit there, do your knitting, you know, whatever. Okay, so she secluded herself, I think, for a very simple reason that she was just protecting her pregnancy. Now, of course, you might say, well, if she believed this was from God, she would know that she's not going to lose the baby. That's overthinking it, folks. Don't overthink things, okay? Don't overthink things, all right? And then, of course, we know what happens, of course. The child is born. He's still deaf, or he's still dumb, mute. And so he writes down John. They say, we don't got any relatives named John. And he says, well, John is what his name is going to be. John means God is gracious. God is gracious, or grace of God in Hebrew. Okay, so his name is John. And one last thing real quick, he's a Nazarite, which means the Nazarite vow. You can look it up, okay? You can look in your concordance, Nazarite vow, and then go to those references in Numbers and Leviticus, and in I think in Samuel, Judges, a couple other places where the Nazarites are discussed. They don't cut their hair, and they don't shave, they don't imbibe alcohol, and so on and so forth. And usually a Nazarite vow is only for a certain number of years. Paul wished to take a Nazarite vow. He was prevented from doing so because he was arrested, taken to Rome. But he wanted to, and it was only for a short time. Nazarite vows can be taken for any amount of time. They can be taken for a few hours. They can be taken for a half a day. They can be taken for a week, or they can be taken for a lifetime. It all depends on the situation. So a Nazarite vow can be any length. The angel said he's going to be a Nazarite. In other words, he's not just going to take a Nazarite vow for a certain period of time. He's going to actually be one. He's going to embody that vow with his entire life. So that's why he was that way till he lost his head. All right. So just a little bit about John the Baptizer, just to fill in the gap. I wouldn't want any gaps to remain. All right. Let's move on then. Gabriel's visit to Mary. All right, Gabriel's visit to Mary. We have Gabriel's visit to Mary in Luke 1, 26 to 38. So first of all, what do we got? Well, let's see. Reading along here, in the sixth month of what? Well, the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, which would make John, of course, 6 months older than Jesus, right? So this can also help us, by the way, preview, time for a commercial, okay? Tomorrow will be my annual discussion of Christmas, all right? And a lot of that we'll discuss why December 25th and about what year it was. And I'll give you a sneak peek right away. There is no such thing as year zero. No year zero. Okay? As a matter of fact, at the time Jesus was born, it wasn't no AD, BC either, for that matter. Okay? So, anyway. So, we're going to talk about Little Christmas next time, or on Sunday, tomorrow morning. John was 6 months old in Jesus. Also, what else does it talk about? It talks about Galilee and Nazareth, and the angel Gabriel again. All right? And remember that Israel is divided into 3 provinces, or Palestine, what we would say Palestine proper, okay? And Palestine proper, if you want to, is usually considered, here is Dan, here's Tyre and Sidon in Lebanon, and from just below Tyre, okay? Just below Tyre, kind of on a line straight across here to this little lake. This would be the top border of Israel most of the time. Now, during the times of David and Solomon, Israel's border went all the way to Syria, all the way to the Euphrates River. That was a very small piece of history, very small years, 80 years max, probably not even that long, that Israel extended the border that long. So this is the top, right? If you want to say Tyre, this is the, oh shoot, I forgot the name of it. I forgot the name of that river, but it's a big river in Lebanon. You hear it all the time. Anyway, from this river down, okay, from the Jordan River over here and down here to the River of Egypt, which is down here a little further. Not Nile, but the River of Egypt down here. All right, so in here are 3 provinces. Roman provinces, ruled over by the Romans, okay? Judea is one in the middle is Samaria, one on the top is Galilee. Other Roman provinces were over here was Decapolis, down here was Petros. This was sometimes included with this area. Anyway, so there were three areas. Galilee is the top area. All right. Joseph and Mary are engaged, a virgin engaged to a man whose name was Joseph. Joseph was of the line of David, as was Mary. Now, this engagement, most likely, this engagement took place soon after Mary was born. And Joseph could be as much as 12 years older. By the time a young man is of the age of bar mitzvah, which is 12 to 13, depending on what time of the year he's born and all that, by that time it is assumed that he will survive. And therefore he is eligible, after his bar mitzvah, of course, he is eligible bachelor. So as soon as you are bar mitzvahed, you are eligible to be engaged. Very few 13-year-olds have the wherewithal to take care of themselves and or a wife, and so they wouldn't get married then. But that's when you would be eligible, right? Girls, on the other hand, when they were born, it was figured that probably more of them lived. The birth of girls was more than the birth of boys. Let's put it that way. And in most societies, that is true. The only way it's not true is if the society aborts or brings infanticide on the girls. For example, in China. In China, there are a lot more girls than boys, but it would be even worse, worse if you want to use that word, I don't know, but a lot of Chinese women abort when they find out that they're having girls, because for all their egalitarianism, for all their communism, for all their equality, it's still preferred to have boys. Yes, sir. Oh, big time, yeah.
Because their whole population.
Oh, yeah,
is going
yeah. Well, so is every country, yeah.
Wasn't it recently, within the last few years, maybe it's longer, that China didn't want women to get pregnant more than one, have one child? They
The
didn't
one-child
want
policy, right, the one-child policy was instituted in the 90s and
Okay.
quickly abandoned in the 2000s
Yeah, I thought
because they saw their demographics going into the floor. I'm sorry, not 90s, 80s, really. The one-child policy began in the 80s. But now, of course, they're encouraging couples to have two, but of course, by now, it's really kind of too late. They goofed up and they didn't solve it, or they didn't deal with it as soon as they could. Most of the nations, a little off topic, but just to finish what Bruce was saying, most of the nations of the world, including the United States of America, are far below the replacement rate. If you ever want to know what the replacement rate is, it's 2.1. No, now 2.5 is easier to remember. But every woman needs to produce 2.5 children. Okay, of course, that's average, right? Every woman needs to, so for every woman that has one, you need another woman to have 3. Basically, that's what it means, all right? So 2.5. If it falls below 2.5, that means this generation is not going to replace the past generation that's dying off, all right? In the United States, the birth rate is below now 2, okay? It's 1.7 and probably lower than that. Probably the next census, all the figures aren't out, but I'm guessing that the 2020 census will tell us that the birth rate is probably 1.5 or 1.4. In some places in Europe, in France, in Italy, in Spain, it's 1.1 or 1.2. In some places like the Soviet Union, before the fall of the Soviet Empire, it was down to 0.8. And it has been horrible for a long time, which is one of Putin's problems. You notice when he said, okay, I'm going to draft everybody and everybody show up, a lot of the people who were showing up, a lot of the men who were showing up were 40 and 50 years old. It's kind of like what happened in the United States during World War II. You know, I don't know if you know this or remember this, but the draft age was only lowered to 18 in early 1941. Did you know that? The draft age was 21. Draft age was 21. Yeah, all through the 30s, the draft age was 21. And it was not lowered to 18 until right before the war. And then, of course, it was capped at 35. And then that cap went away in 1943, went up to 45. Of course, it wouldn't most likely be put on the front lines at 45, but still, that's what happens when you need as my father would call it in those days, cannon fodder. Okay? You basically need some body. What did he say? It got to a point in the war where you just needed bodies to absorb bullets. That's all you needed. You needed to throw somebody in front of you. If you were experienced, if you were a hardened combat experienced person, as my dad was by 1943, and you're going to invade an island, you want 3 or 4 young green body bags to throw in front of you, and let them take those first bullets, so that then you, with your experience, you can maybe make some headway on the beach or whatever. He made 9 opposed landings and survived all 9 of them, which was pretty amazing when you stop and think about it. Anyway, so when a country gets to that point, it's what's Putin's problem is, as he's throwing more and more and more troops into the meat grinder in Ukraine, he's depleting his forces back home, and he's digging into his. It's kind of like digging into your principal. If you, you're not just using interest anymore. You're digging into your principal. So anyway, so Mary is engaged to Joseph probably after she is weaned. All right, weaning off the breast took place when you were 2 or 3, maybe in some cases, and it didn't take place because you necessarily wanted it. It would take place because, again, women were having a lot of children. And so when you either needed to have another child, some of you may know it's not an old wives' tale. There's actually some truth to it. When you're nursing, you are less likely to become pregnant. It's not foolproof, but you are less likely to become pregnant if you are nursing. And so if you needed to have another child, okay, say for the farm sake, or maybe one died or something like that, you would stop nursing. And so you would wean the child off the breast so that it was start them on solid food. So whatever time it was, between 2 and 3 years old, they would stop that, okay? And then that would be a time they would say, okay, we think again this child is going to probably make it, but even if not, there's a lot more girls than boys, and so we're not going to worry about it. And so then they would, kind of have an auction, if you will. Everybody would know, okay, Mary, son of Anna, and Joachim, I think was his name, what's her father's name, is available. Bids will now be accepted. Okay? And we know that Mary's family was also very poor. I don't remember what they did for a living. We know Joseph was a carpenter, and we're not even 100% sure about that. There is no Hebrew term for carpenter. There's no real Greek term for it either. He was the much more accurate term for that job was not carpenter. The much more accurate term would be construction worker. In other words, he was a guy who could put stuff together. When you got your table from IKEA, you would call Joseph, and he would come and put it together for you. Okay? Or if you needed some work done on your roof, you had a hole in your thatch, you would call Joseph, and he could patch it for you. If you had a hole in your wall, he would come and dig up some new mud, maybe some rock, and put it in there and patch up your hole. So he was a fixer. He was a handyman. All right? It's not like there were trees growing all over the place you could cut down and make into chairs and tables. For in the first place, they didn't use chairs. You could go to 100 Jewish homes and never find a chair of any kind. And if you did find a table, it sat on the ground, very low to the ground, because they sat on the ground when they ate, much as the Japanese do. So to call Joseph a carpenter is really not very accurate at all. Again, what Mary's father did, I don't remember off the top of my head. Anyway, so they're both very poor. Nobody is going to want to marry into poverty, one way or another, either male into female, female into male. And so probably the poor people in Nazareth knew each other pretty well, probably, and some poor family, family of Joseph, for example, would see, oh, here's a new one, and maybe they were interested that she is in the line of David also, could be, that's possible, and say, oh, we'll take her. And so here Joseph is 12 or 13, Mary is 3 or 4, so at least 10 years difference between them. This is why the idea that you see in a lot of creches, a lot of manger scenes, you see Mary very fresh-faced, very young, okay, and you see Joseph with a beard and looking somewhat older. That's why. But it was not considered odd, it was not considered weird to be engaged for many years. The engagement ceremony was just that, a ceremony. It was time for party hardy, okay? The marriage ceremony was nothing. There was no marriage ceremony. No, there was no marriage ceremony. There was no I do's or I wills, nothing. When Joseph, in his case, and maybe he was real close by this time, but by the time the angel appears to Mary, maybe the wedding is already planned, could be, or in the planning stages. But by this time, Joseph, whenever a man got to a point where he's making enough shekels, okay, first of all, he's got his own place. You don't go and get your wife and bring her back to mom and dad's house. No, you don't do that. All right, you don't do that. Especially in poor people houses, because why?
It's already full.
Yeah, there are no, but at this point in history, there are no bedrooms. Everybody sleeps in the same room, okay? Which is just not conducive to a good honeymoon, you know? So you wouldn't do that. You wait until Joseph had his own place, either built the place or probably rented a place, if you will, or maybe bought one, I don't know, if he sold an animal, if he had one. But in any case, you got to buy, you had to have your own place, and you got to be bringing in enough silver coin or whatever that you can feed yourself and at least one other person, or soon 1.5 or 2. Okay, so you got to be bringing in the coin. All right. Once you get to that point, you simply announce. You tell the father of your engaged spouse. You tell the father, in this case Mary's father, hey, let's say what's today? Today is Sunday. Okay, on Friday, I got to clean my house and get it ready. But by Friday, I'm going to be coming to get my wife. And he would say that. He wouldn't say, I'm coming to get my bride. He would say, I'm coming to get my wife. Right? Because it's his wife, legally. Okay? And so then he would come in and get, and then there would be the party. The party would be after he gets the bride, takes her back to his house, and the party's at his house, not the bride's house. Party's at his house. Okay? And so that was a marriage. No boutonnieres, no bridesmaids, none of that. That stuff's all modern stuff. Okay. So anyway, so Mary is engaged. She's married for all intents and purposes. She's married. All right. And so the angel appears, and the Bible says the angel salutes her. What does that mean? What does that mean? Why does the Bible say that? Why doesn't the Bible just say the angel said hi?
Showing respect.
Respect, honor, yes. The angel honored Mary as what she is going to be, the mother of God. So, by just the way that the greeting was said, all right, this is unusual. This is not your normal, hey, how are you? Howdy. Hey, what's up? Que pasa, man? Okay? This is, by just the words that are used, the way the words are used, this is big deal. Why does the angel call her full of grace? This is a big deal for, of course, our Roman friends. Our Roman friends say that this means that she was sinless. How do we know that full of grace, Hail Mary, full of grace, how do we know that full of grace does not mean sinless? Boy, you guys wouldn't do real well sitting in a Roman catechism class, would you? Wow.
Mary was a sinner.
Mary was a sinner. How do you know that?
Well, she's not sinless, but
How do you know that? You just met her. How do you know that?
She had that glow and halo around her head.
Well, that would say she was sinless, but she's not sinless. Okay, listen again. Greetings. The NASB is better. It says, favored one, the Lord is with you. So, grace, full of grace, favored one. And by the way, when you see that, when you see the translations can be so different, full of grace, favored one, not even the same words, you know that there's something going on. You know that there's some shenanigans being pulled with the translation to English. Okay, that one side or the other side is trying to push a point. All right? Let me get my Greek Bible out here real quick.
well, she's going to be the mother.
All right? Well, that's true.
Make her favored, for sure.
Well, she was pure because she didn't have any kids.
Well, she was a virgin, right? And by the way, parthenos, right, which is the Greek word for virgin, parthenos is a medical term. Okay? And guess who's writing this? Luke. And Luke is a doctor. doctor. Yes, he's a physician, so he would know. Now, I will grant you, okay, a couple of things. Let's talk about that in a minute, because I think it's important. Our Roman friends very picky about this, the virginity of Mary. You have to understand a couple things. Until the Middle Ages, really the late Middle Ages, very little was known about anatomy. It was, in most cultures, illegal to carve up a dead body. Most of the physician knowledge at this point in history is trial and error knowledge. So at the time of Hippocrates, for example, the Hippocratic Oath, right? First, do no wrong. Hippocrates didn't know how the stomach worked. He didn't know how the heart worked. At this time in history, people, they don't even know what the brain is for. Nobody's even seen a brain unless, it got cracked open on a battlefield somewhere. And then nobody sat down and made studies of it. Do you know, at the time of Leonardo da Vinci, he could have been put in prison for life for what he was doing? Oh, yeah. He could have been executed in some places in Italy. So when people talk, you hear this about virginity in the Old Testament, that the elders are supposed to prove a young woman's virginity. Good luck with that. Good luck with that. In the first place, the hymen is not a solid piece of flesh or tissue. It's not solid. It has a hole in it. Otherwise, y'all would blow up. Yeah. So that's the first thing. Okay. The second thing, it can rupture or break for all kinds of reasons. Okay. So we don't know. I would have to go digging into the Mishnah or the Talmud probably to find out what those Jewish elders were actually comparing with, or how they were deciding this. And I have never had the interest to do that. All right. So when the Bible talks about parthenos, and when Luke, a physician, uses the term parthenos, okay, this is solely based on the testimony of the Virgin herself. And this is not there's no medical proof here, because you cannot prove this medically. Okay, that is a misnomer. This also, by the way, just a side point, this also tells you one way in which the Islam religion is so backwards. The Islam religion has women inspected before marriage to see if they're virgin, and the only regulation they look for, the only thing they look for is an intact hymen. That's it, nothing else. Which is ridiculous. A lot of Islamic women get stoned to death for no reason, simply because they rode a horse too hard, or bicycle, or Lord knows what. Okay, I mean, it's really sick. The Islam, you really want to know how sick the Islam religion is. That's how sick it is. They're so stupid. They're so backwards medically. They have no knowledge. It's just really sad, it's pathetic. So, okay. So let me get to this real quick here. The angel came, hail. Okay, 28. Entering to her, he said, hail. Okay. And I like this. The actual verb tense is a past perfect participle. Past perfect participle should be translated having been favored. Having been favored. In other words, this was done in past time. It's not that you yourself are so favorable. It's not that you are so holy and perfect, Mary. It's because you have been favored in the past. Okay? The Lord is with you. You were favored a long time ago. When was Mary favored?
Which is what?
Before she was.
In eternity. That's exactly right. When were you favored? In eternity. When were you favored? In eternity. And you and me, every one of us, all believers were favored in eternity. That's all that the angel was saying. That's it. Hail Mary, you be saved. Hail Mary, you're full of grace. That is, not your grace, you're full of the grace of God. By faith. That's all it means, my dear Roman friends. Okay? That's all it means. You're full of the grace of God by faith. The same as any other believer on the face of the planet. Now the hail part, yeah. I salute you as the mother of God. Right? But the grace part has nothing to do with her supposed perfection. That's just dumb. And the Lord is with you. And she, at that saying, she was greatly disturbed. That'll have to be our last point. So she was greatly disturbed. Why was Mary greatly disturbed? Well, in the first place, how many people have angels show up and talk to them? Now, you'd be disturbed too. I guarantee you'd be disturbed. All right? I mean, right away you would be saying, okay, what do you want? What do you want? Or you might say, what did I do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think she was, because she was gonna be the mother of Jesus?
She didn't know that yet.
She didn't know that at that time.
She didn't know
I was
that
gonna
yet.
say, maybe she was just like, wow.
No, she will do that later. Yeah, she'll do that later. But no, at this point, she doesn't know what the angel wants. She's just upset because he says, hail. Hail.
She's like,
And she's going, what are you hailing me for? What did I do? What did I do something wrong?
Right.
Okay. We'll pick it up at that point next time.
when, so you said it was later on. So was this when she was older and,
No, later in this incident, okay, later in this incident, the amazement kind of hits her.
yeah,
And that's when she says, it will be to me just as you have said. Or colloquially translated in most translations, let it be. Let it be, let it be. Let it be, let it be. Yeah.
Which point are we starting? Is it 4?
We'll finish 3. I have a few more things to say before I get to Elizabeth's visit, but yeah, we'll finish 3. There's a couple things more. I always hope to do one of these each time, but like today, I felt like I should probably say something about poor John. Just I don't want John's fans to get upset. See, try to assassinate me or something. So all right. So, yes, we'll pick this up. And so tomorrow, Exodus, but before Exodus, just a little bit on Christmas. All right? You may be excused. Have yourself a wunderbar day.
thank you, Pastor.
Okay, thank you.